Hey, welcome to Chapter 21, Immigration and Justice. Term that's thrown out a lot, depending on which side you're on, illegal immigrant, right? An illegal immigrant is a foreigner who resides in the United States unlawfully, right? They're not here, they don't have documents, they are not here legally. A great many of them get visas and then stay past the time that they're allowed to be here. Others sneak in through various means. Probably what we hear most about is those that come in through the Mexican border. That's probably the most popular route that we talk about these days. But immigrants used to come in through the Canadian border and sometimes sneak in on ships, right? So it depends on where you're from. Central and South Americans come up through the Mexican border. Europeans used to fly into Canada and then sneak across the wilderness of either Maine, Vermont, or Minnesota, someplace like that, and then hook up with relatives or friends who are already living here. Immigrants from Asia used to pay smugglers to get them over here in cargo ships or in container ships. All of these things are dangerous because since you're not doing it under the protection of any government, you are subject to crime and persecution, right? 1.3 million people are believed to be in this country illegally. More a politically correct term is undocumented. But 1.3 million, which represents about 3.5% of the United States population. There were no immigrant laws in the United States till 1882. So 100 years into this country's existence, there were no laws on immigration. In fact, immigrants were welcomed, for the most part, with open arms. In 1882, the Immigrant Act came into being, and the idea of the Immigrant Act was basically to tax immigrants coming into the country, charge them a fee for coming into the country, and also they started to give them examinations, and they would ban you or return you to your country if they decided you were ill or psychologically ill or mentally ill, something like that, or if you had some sort of a disease. And that was up to doctors or immigration officials. And part of that was because of the history of immigrants bringing disease with them, and also part of it was to make money, and then part of it was to bar certain people from coming into the country. And nowadays we hear a lot about Latino or Hispanic immigrants coming in, but back in the 1880s it was a lot of European immigration they were trying to stop, and also Chinese immigration, right? So in 1882 the Chinese Exclusion Act banned Chinese from coming to this country for the most part, and that lasted until 1943 when the Magnuson Act reduced that some. It didn't completely do away with it, but it reduced it some. In 1965 the Preferred Categories Act came into being, and that was when they started to allow immigrants from places that they thought would, in professions and positions that they thought would benefit the country, right? That became the employment-based immigration. And then in 1990, there was the Immigrant Act of 1990 began a path for illegal immigrants to come to the country and stay in the country. 1815 to 1950, 30 million European immigrants arrived. Some were rejected, not thrown out of the country, but rejected by those of our ancestors who were living here already, and very often they were stereotyped. The book goes into some of the stereotypes, I won't. Essentially, what a stereotype does is essentially they find something about a immigrant class that has some sort of basis in fact, and they label you and your entire your country people with that negative stereotype, right? War also played a part in immigration and how immigrants were accepted into this country. Think about how Japanese immigrants were rounded up during World War II and put into camps to protect us from them becoming Japanese sympathizers. Although Japanese sympathy for Japanese imperialism in World War II was almost non-existent. Think about sometimes sometimes even after the war, those thoughts linger. So probably something that lingers a little bit more was Vietnam, right? So the war in Vietnam officially ended in 1973, and a lot of the people who were on our side, them and their relatives were brought over here as refugees, right? Refugees, and they were assimilated into the country, but they faced a lot of racism. There's one of the books that I put up on the website on Canvas for you to read is called Bringing the War Home, right? And it's a book about how returning veterans from Vietnam basically rejected anyone who was different, especially the people who were from Southeast Asia, because they had just been fighting with them overseas. And so there are some really difficult stories about how returning soldiers ended up clashing with these Vietnamese and Cambodian immigrants who were settling all over the country. Right? Interesting book. A green card. A green card is essentially is a resident from another country who's allowed to stay and live in the United States. And the green cards are issued to family members of people who are citizens. They're issued green cards for reasons of employment, and they are given special status. And special status is either refugee or asylee, right? So across the world, there are things like war, disaster, persecution, things like that make it difficult to live in those countries. Now, a refugee is someone who was forced to flee those countries, and have no choice. They're chased out by the devastation. And an asylee, someone who seeks asylum, is someone who chooses to leave those areas, right? And sometimes that's the assigned category is up to the person who's discussing it at the moment, right? But the difference in definition is refugees are forced to leave and asylees choose to leave, right? In 2015, 180 million immigrants came to this country on legal visas. 1.7 million came here for work. 500,000 stayed past their visa expiration, right? And became illegal immigrants. They were no longer here on the legal status. Policing immigrants, we're talking about the immigrant justice system, which was started in the 1980s. The infamous ICE is a part of that, right? So policing is ICE. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agents, right? These are the people who are vilified by politicians for their actions against immigrants, right? So they're basically said to be scooping up people who are here undocumented and throwing them into cages with their families and children and then forcing them to leave via the courts. But that's really only a fraction of what they do. They are more focused on people who are here in the United States and actively engaged in crime or commit crime, right? But you probably don't realize that because of the way our headlines are. Customs and Border Patrol, those are people who patrol the border down in the South, who are looking for people who are trying to cross the border. But there are also the people. There are also people who are in airports, and they're trying to make sure that you're not bringing anything into the country illegally. Once again, because they want to, if you're bringing large amounts of something to sell or something with value, the government wants to tax that, right? The court system established in 1983 under executive order for immigration review. There are 58 courts, immigration courts in the United States. To enter the United States correctional systems, anywhere, there are 3 ways to enter. You either get a federal conviction, a state conviction, or you're detained for deportation, right? Those are the only three ways you can be detained for your immigrant status in the United States. There are there are estimated 25,000 immigrants currently incarcerated in the United States, but that is just a guess. They really don't know, because some of the people who are incarcerated will not tell you what the status is. Employment-based immigration is essentially what they've done is there's 140,000 visas issued each year under basically what's called employment preference. You can feel free to research this further, but essentially what we're talking about, the first employment preference are one of 3 categories. You either have extraordinary abilities, these are the athletes, artists, and scientists, and so what they're telling you here is that this is how a baseball player comes over to the United States without having to go through the process that most immigrants do. A baseball team wants them. These people are exceptional athletes, extraordinary abilities in athletics, and their baseball teams, the organization has a lawyer who goes through the process, completes the paperwork, and it's essentially a done deal. There's no issues unless there's some sort of serious criminal behavior in the country you came from, right? The second category is professors and researchers, and these are people who are basically extraordinary in their field as well, and they will bring some sort of a cultural benefit to the United States. And then you have the multilingual managers. So these are people who are going to come in and work in business, but they speak multiple languages. Generally speaking, 2 languages isn't enough to qualify you for this. They're talking about multiple languages, and it's not that unusual for people from other countries to speak multiple languages. And sometimes it's the language that they're looking for, right? If you speak Cantonese you're going into the banking industry, or they feel like that the business you're going into is something that would benefit the country, they will sometimes give you preferential treatment. For a while, a lot of the Middle Eastern dialects gave you preferential treatment, but usually, strictly speaking, they're trying to get people in here who are speaking more than 2 languages, not just English and their home language, other languages as well. Now, and when we talk about immigration and the backlash of immigration in this country, we're talking mostly about people who sneak over the border, right? They're talking about people who are doing jobs that most others don't do. They're landscapers, they're laborers. These are the people who sit in the Home Depot parking lot and wait to be picked up and paid $100, $150, maybe $200 if they're lucky for a day's wages to help out and support themselves and their families. These are the people that we argue over all the time coming into this country, right? But you're all college students. Are the people that are coming in and standing in the Home Depot a bigger problem for you than the people who are given extraordinary, exceptional employment preference? These people are the people who are taking professional, high-paying jobs, not these people. That's something for you to think about, right? This is the debate. Immigration boosts the economy, takes jobs that others don't want, right? Those are things that they say. They say that there is this belief that laborers outside of major urban environments that are covered by unions, laborers or small businesses can't function without this cheap labor that these immigrants, these undocumented immigrants, provide them. And for other people, it's something that depresses wages, because you pay those people such a little amount of money, then you're not paying union people, you're not paying the prevailing wage of the day, and you're also taking jobs away from citizens, right? And there is this debate that says people don't want to do those jobs, right? They don't want to cut lawns. They don't want to carry big rocks out of construction sites. They're not interested in doing that. And then there are other people who say, I'd love to do that job, but I want to do it a legal job. I want to be eligible for unemployment. I'm eligible for disability insurance, which these people who are doing these wages illegally are not. They're not covered under any insurance or any sort of legislation that protects workers, right? And one of the biggest myths that come up coming along with immigration is that immigrants commit a lot of crime, commit much crime, and that they help terrorism. The reality is all statistical data that we have indicates that immigrants are far less likely to commit crime than our people who are here. That may be because they're afraid of being deported. It may be because they come from a different culture and they don't understand how to commit the crime. I don't know exactly why that is, but there's no statistical evidence that says immigrants commit greater crime than our own citizens, right? And helping terrorism, like 9/11 is the greatest terrorist act that's occurred on our soil. Those people were all naturalized American citizens. And most of the terrorist incidents that happen are basically what they call homegrown terrorists. So people who are either or live here or citizens of here, were born and raised here, and who are not sneaking across the border to commit terrorist acts. This whole policing thing, one thing I skipped over is the idea of sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. Sanctuary cities are basically cities that say they're not going to cooperate with the enforcement of immigration policy, and it starts with basically just scooping up people here who are undocumented, and then it becomes essentially that they won't cooperate with them in any way. So sometimes that undocumented immigrants are arrested for committing crimes, and there are a few odd cases where cities allow them to leave before the federal government can come in and detain them for their immigrant status, right? Probably only happens in rare occasions, but once again, it's negative media, it gets our attention. That's not, let's also, but that's not really just the media's fault, is we're drawn to this negative attention. If we were drawn to positive attention, that's what we'd be seeing, right? Sanctuary cities and also sanctuary states. States like California, Massachusetts, and even here in New York, they're all called sanctuary states, where they have declared that they are not going to cooperate with immigration laws that are geared towards strictly geared towards targeting those who are undocumented. But that also depends on the state, how far they're willing to take it. And the federal government sometimes withholds funds because of the status of sanctuary city. If you're not going to cooperate with the federal government, then why should the federal government give you money, right? And they sue. There's lawsuits that come into play for that, right? So your homework is to research DACA and DAPA, right? And those two things are things that President Trump tried to change, and in some ways did. Your homework is to write a paper on that and explain exactly what those two things are and how they are, their evolution, so to speak, as law. All right? I think we got one more week to go. Thank you for your attention today, and I'll talk to you next week.